Welcome to FS-ISAC's podcast, FinCyber Today. I'm Elizabeth Heathfield, Chief Communications Officer at FS-ISAC. Third-party risk has been a huge topic here at the EMEA Summit in Amsterdam. So we spoke with Burim Bivolaku, BISO at Intercontinental Exchange for Trading and Clearing, and also the chair of our new UK Strategic Subsidiary Board, about how he's thinking how we manage as a sector what some are calling an impossible problem. So let's start with the UK Subsidiary Board. You're the chair. Tell me why you felt it was important to get involved.
So I think UK Subsidiary Strategic Board, I think that was sort of in the making for many years. I think I've been involved with FS-ISAC for many years now, and I've seen incremental enhancement of governance structures, regional governance structures throughout the years, with creation of regional threat intelligence committees, board resilience committees. And I think this was a sort of logical step to enhance overall that governance structure. And I think that's important because they are local jurisdictional complexities and requirements that members, FS-ISAC members have in their respective jurisdiction. They are expectations that they're supposed to meet, in relation to the sharing and collaboration, in respect to authorities' involvement. And while obviously FS-ISAC, it's important that has a global remit because the cyber risks and threats are global in nature. It is important to respect those local jurisdictional requirements. So I think with the FS-ISAC UK board, my organization has been quite keen for that to happen, to meet the requirements of the members, hence obviously our involvement as well, and me getting involved personally as well.
Great. All right, let's talk about one of the topics that everybody's been talking about, third-party risk. It's definitely been a big topic here at the summit. So let's start with, what do you see as like the primary challenges that we're facing now, given the fact that we actually have been doing, obviously, third-party risk management for a long time and probably quite mature as a sector in terms of how we handle it, but there are still challenges. How do you look at that?
Yeah, I think third-party risk, obviously, it's an issue which is dependent on each organization. So each organization specifically has different reliance on third parties. Some of them have more reliance, some of them have less reliance. Overall, I think with the cloud provisioning of and other type third party risk overall for the sector have gained prominence, and I think that's why we are talking more about that as well. And that's why I think these are now being picked up by regulatory trends as well. And we have regulatory trends being spearheaded both in UK and EU with the respective legislation being promulgated. So you've got that aspect of third-party risk management. But I think there is another aspect which, us, the financial sector as a community, have been promoting and doing for many years, and which is the collaboration. And I view really the collaboration aspect, in addition to the regulatory aspect, as complementary. And you cannot really over-rely on regulatory, i.e. compliance requirement, and ignore the collaborative aspect of managing third-party risk. And so I think from that perspective, as a sector, we have a big role to play promoting that collaboration, bringing third parties into the fold of trusted collaboration, like we have been doing amongst ourselves in the financial sector. So doing that with third parties and critical third parties, I think it's important to manage the third party risk.
One thing that I have heard also a lot about is, okay, we're doing, it's a challenge, but we're doing okay with third parties. But once you start thinking about fourth parties and fifth parties and the suppliers of suppliers, it just becomes something that is almost impossible, like an impossible problem. Do you agree with that? How are you handling that? How are you thinking about that? How do we as a sector think about it?
Well, I think it's important to for each organization who are engaging third parties to perform a service. It is important to specifically define that sort of interface with third parties, and then from there stems the outputs that from the kind of cyber risk perspective third parties may present. We talk about third parties. How do we deal in case there are issues and problems? But we have to be really specific in each case because the outcomes of a problem with a third party can manifest in different ways from the cyber risk perspective. It can manifest in the way that there could be an outage of a service. It can manifest because that could be some sort of data theft and so forth. And then people talk about contagion risks. So it depends really how you approach. And if you define the interface with a specific third party or a service that you consume from a third party, those challenges can be minimized. It cannot be a contagion risk if the interface that you have with a third party cannot be used to propagate malware. So, we know techniques and tactics and how the malware can propagate. So you cannot have a contagion risk if actually physically it is not possible through the interface that is defined to have that contagion. But it depends on that specific interface.
Right.
And then there are challenges in terms of data and so forth, which are obviously dealt through a contractual relation with the regulation. So I think all these are important to, in aggregate to deal with a third-party risk. The fourth parties and third parties, again, that's something that obviously can be requested through contractual relation, depending on the risk appetite of the firms. You can say that for any fourth party, you have to tell me. So you contractually obligate a third party to inform you. Sometimes that may not be the case. So you have to be prepared to manage that risk if that is not the case.
There's also, I think, like a distinction that we need to draw or at least pay attention to in terms of the cyber and technical risk. As you were talking about, right? There's the data issues, or malware issues, and then there's the availability of the service issues. And then it begins to involve a whole other set of people beyond the cyber security department. How are you thinking about that? And how, is there any kind of guidance that you can give, especially as a BISO, on how firms should be thinking about, involving the wider business units into these kinds of risk management considerations?
Well, it has to be that way. Information security, cybersecurity is just one aspect of it. There are other implications with third parties that are providing services. And as I mentioned, some organizations do not really rely a lot for performing their critical services. Some do. So automatically, I think there has to be a wider involvement of all different aspects of the business and different departments when dealing with these type of issues. Cybersecurity in its own, or information security, cannot manage the third-party risk. This is a more comprehensive, multiple disciplinary problem that everyone has to be involved with in the organization.
Yeah. If suppliers or third parties could do something to make our jobs a little bit easier in managing this, what would it be?
So I think that's kind of an interesting question. I do feel with all what has actually been going on in the sector, getting a better collaboration with the third parties and getting those third parties involved with the sector is something that really I would strongly welcome. And I think that's the reason for that is because proactively, when there are no issues and incidents, we have to proactively share, proactively know each other, know our programs, so that we can build a level of trust with the third parties, rather than just simply relying on some sort of due diligence program questionnaires where we ask third parties, we get responses and so forth. There has to be that proactive approach on sharing capabilities so that we build a level of trust. So that's when there are no issues. When there are incidents, that becomes even more important, because then, that trusted level of sharing and collaboration will help in many ways, understanding what the issues are and then preparing when the issues are resolved to reconnect to those third parties.
Yeah. So what do you think that could look like? In terms of how do we get them involved? I mean, obviously we have our critical providers program at FS-ISAC, and we've been doing great in terms of having channels for sharing and even doing research together and sharing insights. But at a broader level, what would you ask of the suppliers?
So I think what FS-ISAC doing as a community, I think that's exactly what I'm asking to be. But I think we probably have to dig a bit deeper because criticality of third parties is dependent on each specific sector. So each subsector may have differing critical parties that another sector find it not so critical. Yeah. So it has to be on a sector-specific level. At the moment, FS-ISAC program is great, looking at critical third parties, primarily cloud, various cloud and big cloud providers. But I think we have to find ways within the community to involve and engage these third parties at a specific subsector, because then it's when it becomes actually quite important and effective.
You mentioned regulation. Obviously, everybody's talking about DORA. And let's maybe just get into a little bit more about what are the implications for third-party risk management with regards to DORA and the various resilience legislation that's coming down the pike in the UK and in Europe and also in the US?
Well, I think obviously it's like with any other regulation, a regulation impact, or you have to respect and comply with the letter of the law. I think that's goes without saying. But I think I'd like to understand obviously regulation, and I'd like to believe that regulation is there to help reduce the threats to the sector, reduce the risk to the sector. So from that perspective, it needs to be really a collaborative approach. And we as a sector, financial sector, have to provide feedback to ensure that we get the right level of regulation, proportionate, and that regulation then becomes really driving for positive changes. So I think that's kind of my take overall in terms of regulation. From third-party risk management, I think there will be on the firms, there will be some changes, obviously, in how we track third parties and certain requirements that we have to collect. But there will be obviously impact on third parties, because they will be, especially those who get the critical designation, will be the regulated ones. There will be an oversight for those. One thing that I'd like to point out is that the criticality criteria obviously, again, have to be proportionate, so that we don't really have regulation doesn't really capture a lot of third parties, because that could be detrimental to the fact that some third parties may not be able to meet in terms of additional costs, and that will have the result that the overall risk of concentration risk will increase. Yeah, there will be less third parties to actually serve the community.
Yeah, let's just about concentration risk. I mean, obviously, the financial sector is a unique sector. We have unique needs, and we already have, I think, a degree of concentration risk going on. How are you looking at that? I mean, do you try to diversify your suppliers, or like, are firms saying, okay, this is the best supplier for the job, and it doesn't matter if the fact that everybody else is using them as well, because it's the best supplier that we need to serve us? Or is there something about, well, but maybe we need a backup who's different, or maybe we need to look at, the cloud providers that each of our suppliers are using and try to diversify in that way to kind of diversify our risk? Because we could be facing a concentration risk that, could have a systemic impact if something goes really wrong.
Well, I think that, again, depends on each firm, how they look at that, and how, whether the firms are using third parties to actually for the implementation of their critical services. Some firm may choose not to do so. Some firm may choose to do so. So I think that just a approach that is firm dependent, and the way you manage this through overall approach to resilience for the services that are deemed critical within your organization. So regardless whether those services are provided by a third party or not. So I think you have to take that into account when implementing or engaging third parties to perform those services.
I wonder if there's potentially a role for FS-ISAC and other industry bodies to look, though, right? Because if you're saying, well, it's firm dependent, but then as a sector, we could be facing concentration risk where each individual firm doesn't see it, but we see it because we're seeing. I wonder if there's potentially a role to play there to ensure that we're not at least too dependent on a few suppliers without any redundancy or backup.
Yeah, I think collaboration, again, mentioning here is very important from that perspective, because any issues that might happen to a third party, we have better collaboration within FS-ISAC program, for example, for critical third parties. The whole sector may be able to deal better in terms of resilience. But other than that, from the regulatory perspective, those are the, from regulatory perspective, you have the issue of actually collecting information that is relevant to third parties. And I think regulators are doing that. Yeah. So they can actually monitor the impact overall rather than individual firms, because that becomes a bit quite challenging.
You're a BISO, and I haven't interviewed too many of you. So I would like to hear just a little bit about your unique role that you play. And if somebody was interested in becoming a BISO, what should they do?
So I think it's specific to each organization. I think the BISO, or Business Information Security Officer role, has been in the sector for the past few years. Different organizations, different firms have different roles and different requirements for the role. It becomes important when the firms diversify their business operation and then deem that the maturity of their program should increase if the program is actually becomes closer to the businesses that you operate. So from that perspective, the role becomes quite important because it provides a link between the actual program and the specific business segments or business functions, so that ultimately the program gets adapted to the business strategy, providing better approach of following the business strategy and serving the business. So you have the business specific information security officers who are responsible for implementing the program for that specific business.
So what advice would you give to somebody who thinks, that sounds really interesting, I'd like to do that?
Yeah, I think, as part of your day-to-day jobs in information security, understand what actually the business is doing, because by understanding that, you can change your program to serve better the business. And I think that's kind of the link that the BISOs provide for organizations.